Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about the debut album from Drexciya, Neptune's Lair. Right, so, I got a little sidetracked from this discography review, didn't I? Back in October I did a video detailing my feelings on Drexciya's The Quest and their other related early period material, so now it's time to actually get into the duo's proper debut album. Arguably their most easily recognizable work. I'm not sure, it'd be close if that. All their albums are pretty popular among the same audiences, but whatever. This and The Quest were my proper starting points to get into Drexciya for the first time. I want to say I heard this one first, though my first listens to both were in very close proximity to each other, so I don't remember exactly. Now, I didn't have much trouble getting into The Quest back in my high school days, what with how expansive and well-varied that project was, and the darker electro tones behind that one that allowed it to cement more of a unique identity in my mind. Though Neptune's Lair was always a project that I had a bit of a weird relationship with. For many years, I always generally liked this album, though I never connected with it on that deep a level. It was an album that had plenty of neat melodies and some nice lo-fi electro grooves, kinda sorta setting up a loose sci-fi environment. Though back in the day I had a hard time figuring out what about this project stood out to people as so special and forward-thinking. To me, it always hit a pretty similar note to like old classic ambient techno and early IDM records from the early 90s, like your Aphex Twin 8592 or your Audiker and Cunabula kind of stuff. Except not produced as cleanly. And I thought, well, this came out in 1998, what about this really moved the needle so much? I didn't get the hype. Mind you, these were of course my feelings on the album over a decade ago, back when my taste in this genre was a lot narrower than it is now. And on top of that, I wasn't even listening to the full 21-track CD track listing back then. I'd opted to hear the abbreviated 13-track vinyl track listing out of expecting that to have less filler and get more straight to the point. Which it technically did. Most of the album's most essential tracks are included there. Although in retrospect, I don't think cutting the album down like that necessarily did it as much of a favor as I thought. The expanded CD track listing is definitely better since it fleshes out the album's environment a lot better and gives it a greater variety of ideas, where the vinyl track listing focused on just the bigger, catchier core tracks. I've come to realize listening to it that way would kind of be like listening to a Boards of Canada album with most of the interludes cut out, it just wouldn't be the same. Anyway, as I got more used to the CD track listing of the album and I got older and was able to expand my taste in techno, Neptune's Lair has grown on me more and more, and its particular identity in the greater scheme of electronic music, while definitely setting itself apart from the crowd in a more subtle way, that comes in more in the particular way they construct their melodies and grooves. It still feels well cemented enough where I'm able to get something out of it in particular that I can't get out of any other record from the same scene or era, and nowadays I hold it at least equally on par with The Quest, if not even a tiny bit better, depending on my mood. The marginally more lo-fi production style, which is kind of a point of commonality among classic Detroit techno productions, was a hump that took longer for me to get over than I would like to admit. In years previous, I always used to subscribe to the fallacy of projects that sound higher budget being inherently better, which, first of all, is nonsense, since equating production polish with budget is a false equivalency. The amount of money spent to mix and master a record doesn't always dictate how good it sounds. No-name underground artists can sound amazing, and mainstream artists with full-on industry backing can sound like crap. But more importantly, having a production style that is marginally more lo-fi like this, where you can somewhat easily imagine the two guys just wiring together a bunch of analog equipment in their basement or something, is the kind of thing that can have its own separate appeal, which can be and has been specifically sought after on purpose. Even if the sound going into this album isn't that complex, or given the most well-polished or impressive mastering job I've ever heard or anything, they're still more than able to put together some pretty damn striking synth arrangements that do well to set up that futuristic sci-fi vibe they're going for, as well as even being decently catchy in many moments. So, let's finally go through individual tracks. After a quick intro, Temple of Dos de Aqua, which is a bunch of incomprehensible vocal effects, I guess. The album opens up with Species of the Pod, a track that, admittedly, also kind of feels like a second intro track to me. The mix of wobbling and buzzing bass and some sorta unnerving pads with some fairly standard electro beats is cool, and the way the track, just slows down in tempo near the end and comes to, a dead stop is pretty neat, too. But it's the kind of track that would otherwise feel more like some, digression thrown in for extra environmental flavor rather than something that really gets me hyped for what I'm about to listen to or even necessarily makes for the most effective of tone setters. But perhaps these feelings mostly just stem from the fact that the track is immediately followed by Andreaen Sand Dunes, which not only feels like the album's real opener and the point at which things really start to get going, but is also probably just straight up the single most iconic track that Drexciya ever made. Chances are, if you only know one Drexciya track, it's going to be Andreaen Sand Dunes. It may as well act as the duo's theme song or something. Super simple arrangement again, really simple electro beat with some simple pad chords and these little high-pitched squirting melodic blips, and it doesn't really progress much over the course of its 6-minute running time, but it's just a sonic idea that gets lodged in your head and you never forget it after the first time you hear it. It's the first track that always immediately comes to mind whenever I even think about Drexciya in passing. And then there's Running Out of Space, which kind of feels to me like an outro interlude to add on to the previous track, just kind of immediately carries off the same electro groove, although it's still got a pretty different tune to set itself apart in my mind, with more blaring 80s-ish leads going up next to thicker pads and busier bass lines. Just feels more full-sounding and more colorful despite being way shorter and obviously not as catchy. From there we get Habitat O Negative, which kind of brings us into more experimental territory. The beats slow down significantly, there's no real melody or tune besides some squirting bass lines and a few sparse blips and whooshing synth effects that, evoke some old radar equipment in a submarine or something. And then Universal Element is one of the album's hardest hitting and most energetic moments despite being less than 2 minutes. Just got some really punchy marching 80s beat work. The bass lines have a lot more rollicking energy and the melodies are really bright and flashy. That one's a consistent favorite. Oddly enough, that feels more like a key moment for the album than Drifting into a Time of No Future, which is a minute and a half longer but almost feels more like an interlude. But that's still a really cool abstract cut as well. The aggressively buzzing bass and bubbly descending arpeggios make for one of the most unique sounding tracks in the bunch. Polymonoplexus Gel is kind of a more fillerish cut, doesn't have one of the more striking tunes, but I guess the synth string pads on that one do get a fair bit denser and more intense than the average for this album, and the electro bass line is pretty driving too. Though then we get one of the album's biggest centerpieces in Surface Terrestrial Colonization. Another track that, like Andreaen Sand Dunes, is able to make use of its extended, near 7-minute length almost through catchiness alone. Those synth bass lines have a little bit of a funky edge to them and carry one of the album's stickiest hooks. Though there's also sort of a verse-chorus structure going on here too, where some other leads take more of the focus and it kind of switches off between the core hook and something of an ascending bridge to lead out of it, as well as these moments where the drum machines just kind of tap away by themselves and create a sense of tension. Another very easy highlight here. Funk Release Valve is cool. Some of the squirting lead chords do have a little bit of that old Herbie Hancock-ish texture to them, and the bass line drives most of the momentum. Though it's also not one of the catchier tunes, I often don't notice that this isn't just part of the previous track since it feels like a fairly direct continuation. Organic Hydropoly Spores is yet another 2-minute track that I don't notice is on the shorter side. The tempo slows down quite a bit on this one, the beats get fuzzier, the bass gets more buzzing and staccato, the pads more organ-like, and the leads deliver another one of the catchiest hooks on the album. And then Draining of the Tanks evokes the exact idea promised by its title with a much more abstract arrangement of all this aggressively squirting bass that sounds like water pouring out of some outlet that it's not supposed to, along with all these tense and wobbly chord stabs floating out over the top. I guess it makes for a cool sonic mirror to Drifting into a Time of No Future. Although then we get probably the album's single heaviest banger of all in Devil Ray Cove. That one's all overbearing buzzing bass and hard-hitting techno beats with maybe some odd clanking effect acting as a hook. Sounds really menacing and has lots of exciting forward momentum. Honestly, not sure why this got left off the vinyl version. I could have easily swapped this out with Funk Release Valve on that track listing and instantly made the album better, but whatever, that track is great regardless. Fusion Flats is a 1.5-minute long interlude entirely made out of ascending percussion patterns, probably the least essential cut on the album aside from the literal intro, though I don't mind it being here for the sake of adding a tiny bit of extra variety, I guess. But then we get another one of the album's bigger centerpiece moments in Triangular Hydrogen Strain, possibly the album's most cinematic feeling cut, with all these warmer synth string pads building up to all these unnerving chiming melodies, creating a really cool effect and also having a little bit of a loose A-B structure with two different patterns of off-kilter synth blends, which are both decently catchy. That's another very easy highlight. And Oxyplasmic Gyration Beam is another one of the album's catchier moments, though that one's a lot more sparse and jerky. The lead pad chords are way more wiry and blaring. And there's a lot of awkward negative space being created when those chords aren't playing. Still definitely a track that sticks in my mind, I just don't know if it's one of my bigger favorites in comparison to other longer tracks here. After another quick interlude of cinematic pads and skittering effects in quantum hydrodynamics, which feels ready-made to drop into the soundtrack to like a Star Trek episode in a scene where an unknown enemy ship is approaching or something. I don't know, I don't watch Star Trek. We then move on to another one of the album's longest cuts in Lost Vessel, mostly once again sticking to its one idea over nearly 6 minutes, but it's still got a lot of forward momentum in the process. The beats are some of the heaviest and loudest on the album, the bass is buzzing, the pads are tense, the leads have almost something of like an 8-bit chiptune flavor to them, and there's even some MIDI vibraphones in the mix. That's always nice. Bottom Feeders is another sorta odd, not really interlude moment without a strong lead tune, mostly percussion and sparse experimental effects. I suppose acting as a mirror to Habitato Negative, but with a bit more bite to it. Jazzy Fluid strikes me as more funky than jazzy, with its bass lines having a lot more of like a slapping texture to them that feels kind of Amiga-ish, and there's a lot of MIDI chimes and bells, which adds some welcome texture not present elsewhere on the album. And that finally leads us to the closer. C to the power of X plus C to the power of X equals MM equals unknown. It's a little bit of a mouthful of a title, but we're fittingly closing out on an entirely beatless cut with all these more peaceful but still wiry and mildly unnerving pads and some low-key chiming keyboard melodies blipping away over them. Definitely feels like the natural way for an album like this to close out and feels like a satisfying and climactic finish. So that's finally everything to go through on Neptune's Lair. I may have had a complicated relationship with this album over the years, but with enough time, I was eventually won over into getting on board for the hype for it. The tunes are all pretty striking and catchy and easily danceable, but maintain that sci-fi soundtrack vibe very well. The synth arrangements, while sometimes on the simplistic side, still do a good job of creating that unique retro-futuristic vibe and doing justice to the underwater technological imagery the album intended to evoke. And while the abbreviated vinyl track listing does maintain all the album's strongest and catchiest tunes, the extended CD track listing makes the Drexciyan universe feel more lived in and fleshed out, and allows the experience to run together a lot less. I'd probably even recommend this as your starting point to get into Drexciya if you've never heard anything of theirs before. It's probably their most accessible work and feels like a well-formed album experience without getting too demanding lengthwise as the Quest's 2-hour running time might for other people. As long a time as this album took to fully grow on me, by this point I can pretty much hold it up as being just as much of a classic as everyone else says it is, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.